right, good evening and welcome. My name is Nilgün Önder. I'm Associate Dean of Arts at the University of Regina. I would like to thank you all for coming to this event, and I would like to gratefully acknowledge that it is on Treaty 4 lands that we come together tonight for this very important discussion. Each winter, the Faculty of Arts is pleased to present the annual Stapleford Lecture, funded through the generosity of the Ernest William Stapleford and Maud Bunting Stapleford Lecture Fund. This endowed trust was established by the late Elsie Stapleford in memory of her parents. The Reverend Ernest Stapleford was the second president of Regina College and is widely considered a formative president of this institution for laying the groundwork for what Regina College, then a campus of the University of Saskatchewan, would eventually become, the University of Regina. Maud Bunting Stapleford was an extremely active and influential campaigner for expanding the legal rights of women and children, and was a great supporter of the arts and culture. She was involved in various women's organizations and actively pressed for legislative reforms to benefit women and children. Like her mother, Dr. Elsie Stapleford was also a great advocate of children's rights. She helped to create and implement the Ontario Day Nurseries Act, which provided government funding to day nurseries and nursery schools and ensured strict standards and licensing requirements, in the process transforming the regulation and delivery of childcare in Canada. The Stapleford Memorial Endowment allows the Faculty of Arts to present an annual lecture in the spheres that Stapleford family was most engaged: human justice, the status of women, the education and care of children, the rights of the disadvantaged, and the history and art of Saskatchewan. Past lectures have included Zahra Nawaz, the creator of the hit CBC series Little Mosque on the Prairies, Perry Bellegarde, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and Mackenzie Art Gallery creator Timothy Long. This year, we are pleased to present the 2018 Stapleford Lecture in conjunction with the University of Regina's first ever Equity Week. In partnership with multiple groups across campus, Equity Week aims to highlight the issues and barriers faced by various members of the University of Regina community and collaborate on the ultimate goal of achieving equity for all. We are thrilled to be a part of this important campus initiative this year. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Globe and Mail national reporter Nancy Macdonald, who will present a lecture entitled "Are Prisons Canada's New Residential Schools?" I would now like to invite Dr. Bridget Klest, an associate professor in the Department of Psychology, who will provide an introduction of Nancy Macdonald. Thank you.
Nancy Macdonald is an award-winning journalist whose powerful and compelling reporting on national and Indigenous issues has gained high-profile recognition. Macdonald joined the Globe and Mail as a national reporter after 12 years at Maclean's magazine. She is the author of a Maclean's feature story entitled "Welcome to Winnipeg, where Canada's racism problem is at its worst," which garnered national attention and, as she put it, earned her the ire of many in her home province. Another Maclean's article, "Canada's Prisons Are the New Residential Schools," helped highlight the disturbing fact of racism in the justice system, our topic here tonight. Some of her most recent Globe and Mail reporting has focused attention on the unresolved murder of Tina Fontaine, the Indigenous youth whose violent death helped mobilize a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Macdonald has won gold and silver medals at the National Magazine Awards and an award for outstanding journalism from the Canadian Association of Journalists. In 2015, she was runner-up for the Jackman Award for Excellence, offered annually by the Canadian Journalism Foundation. She holds a BA with joint honors in French literature and political science from the University of Manitoba and an MA in political science from McGill University. Macdonald's lecture this evening will point to the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Canada's prisons and explain how a discriminatory justice system works against Indigenous accused at each step in the criminal process. For as she puts it, the ugly current reality is that if you happen to be Indigenous, justice in Canada is not blind. Please welcome Nancy Macdonald.
Tansei, Boozhoo. I live in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh people. I was raised in Manitoba in a tiny Métis Francophone farming community just south of Winnipeg. To the traditional keepers of these lands, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Lakota, the Dakota, the Nakota, and to the Métis Nation, I say, Nenaskomtin, Chimigwech, Marci. I wish to also express my profound thanks to the people who made tonight possible. First and foremost to Elsie Stapleford, who's well known as one of the country's pioneers in early childhood care. Elsie was the one who endowed this speaker series, and from what I gather, she was very much her parents' daughter, a humble visionary, a deep thinker, an advocate, a writer, and way, way ahead of her time. She left Saskatchewan in 1930 to attend the University of Toronto. She was doing graduate studies in early childhood care. The Second World War broke out, and the Ontario government was forced to enter the field of childcare. Dr. Stapleford designed a system of nurseries for the province. These were not just places that mums could safely leave their kids during the day. These were also centers for play-based learning. These were Elsie's laboratories. She went on to become she helped establish the country's first childcare legislation in Ontario and went on to become the director of Ontario's childcare branch. I think she, like her dad, has a special place in her heart for what the Reverend Dr. Ernest Stapleford called his beloved Regina College. I couldn't be more thrilled to be here in what is now the University of Regina. I'm honored to participate in the Stapleford Lecture series that honors the legacy of this distinguished, forceful, and lovely family. I want to also thank Dr. Richard Clear, who's Dean of Arts, for inviting me here tonight, and to the lecture committee for choosing me. I'm well aware of the current climate in the wake of the Gerald Stanley trial. It's really hard to talk about race and racism. It makes us uncomfortable. It puts us on edge. But I think it's really, really important that we find a way to talk about these issues, especially here in the Indigenous heart of the country, here in Manitoba. A government official in Manitoba told me that within the next 20 years, 1 in 3 kindergartners in the province will be Indigenous. The future of Manitoba and Saskatchewan depends on getting this relationship right. It depends on us learning to talk to one another and acknowledge our shared history and warts and all. My dad was from Saskatoon, and the prairies will always be home to me no matter how long I stay away from them. I love the ethic, the spirit of Saskatchewan. I love the sense of community here. I love the wild open skies. I love the beauty of this province. And I admire the work of so many of you here tonight. It feels like I'm among family, and I wanted to thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight to listen to what I have to say. This winter, Canada turned to face itself. You had to ask the question, who are we? What kind of country do we want to be? Saskatchewan and Manitoba were reeling from the aftermath of 2 parallel murder trials. 2 men, both white, were accused of the murders of 2 Indigenous youth, Colton Boushie, a 22-year-old Cree man from the Red Pheasant First Nation, and Tina Fontaine, an Anishinaabe 15-year-old from Sagkeeng, just north of Winnipeg. As we know, juries in both provinces acquitted both men, and the Crowns, both here and in Manitoba, chose not to appeal their verdicts. Each of us heard the cry of injustice that followed. It began with Debbie Baptiste in a courthouse in the Battlefords, Colton's mum's primal response to the not guilty verdict. That cry rumbled and shook Saskatchewan, gathering strength when it joined those of Tina's kin in Manitoba, when Raymond Cormier was acquitted in her death 2 weeks later. In that howl, we heard grief, frustration, rage, humiliation. From some non-Indigenous Canadians, we heard confusion, frustration. He was defending his home, some said. Why can't they see that? Perspective is, of course, everything. You might have thought that way if you grew up in Saskatchewan, drinking water from the tap, going to a well-funded school, where your teacher looked like you and talked like you. But you might feel differently if you went to a dilapidated reserve school, where there wasn't a library or there wasn't a gym, or if you knew from a young age what it feels like to be if you knew from what age what it's like to feel out of place, to feel vulnerable, to be viewed with suspicion when you go to the mall or when you're out on the streets. You might look at the story differently if you feel like you've heard the story many, many times before. So from some Indigenous Canadians, we heard, why does this keep happening? Lindsay Kay, former chief of the Sakamay First Nation south of the city here, said there are 2 justice systems. One justice system for the white, one justice system for the Indian people. And it's all right for a white person to kill an Indian person. But Chief Kay wasn't talking about Tina, and he wasn't talking about Colton. He was talking about Pamela George. The Sakamay woman was found dead, face down in a ditch outside Regina in '95. 2 white university students were out drinking, and they brought her there. George was working part-time as a sex worker. She was trying to raise 2 girls on her own. When they picked her up, one of the men was hiding in the trunk. They later testified they didn't have any money to pay her. They hadn't brought any money to pay her, but they took turns with her. And then they began beating her. George's body was so battered, her family couldn't open the casket at the funeral. An all-white jury found the 2 men not guilty of first-degree murder, but guilty of manslaughter, the lesser charge. Before the jury began deliberations, Justice Ted Malone cautioned jurors. He said it would be very dangerous for you to convict of first-degree murder. He reminded them to bear in mind that George indeed was a prostitute when they considered whether or not the 28-year-old consented to sex. The men served 4 years for her brutal murder. A few years before George was killed, a white supremacist named Carney Nerland was drinking in his pawn shop in Prince Albert with 2 friends, both of them corrections workers. A trapper named Leo Lachance, a member of the Big River First Nation, by all accounts a lovely man with some troubles, walked in. Nerland picked up an assault rifle, shot twice at the floor, then after Lachance exited the pawn shop, fired again through the shop door, killing him. Lachance made it 50 yards before collapsing in the street. While awaiting his day in court, Nerland said he deserved a medal, and he'd done you all a favor for killing a First Nations man. He pleaded guilty as charged to manslaughter and served 3 years in jail. In 2000, William Kakakaway, a member of the White Bear First Nation, was killed at a resort near Carlisle. He was hit in the head with a tire iron. He was being chased up a hill by a group of men following a dispute. Kakakaway was there with his cousin. He was holding a bat. I think he and his cousin had smashed a couple of car windows. And so this group had come after them. A witness heard racial slurs shouted by the men as they charged after Kakakaway up that hill. The tire iron was thrown from 20 feet and hit him in the back of the head. The defendant claimed self-defense. Kakakaway had that bat, and a jury acquitted that person of murder. It sets a precedent for a Caucasian person to come in and kill an Aboriginal, and it's okay, his mum said after the trial. 2 months later, a 12-year-old Saulteaux girl accepted a ride from 3 young white men in Tisdale. They were all in their 20s. They were out drinking and driving together. They gave the girl so much beer she couldn't walk, a witness later testified. Then they took her to a lonely grid road outside Tisdale and took turns having sex with her. There were multiple trials and appeals over 7 years. I'm sure a lot of you remember them. In the end, the initial verdict stuck. 2 men were acquitted and one was found guilty of sexual assault and sentenced to house arrest. The judge in the trial, a guy called Fred Kovacs, argued that the 89-pound child had been a willing participant and an aggressor on the basis she may have been sexually abused in her home. Who was justice served here? It certainly wasn't our Aboriginal child, a member of her family said in the wake of the trial. Now, I'm bringing up these examples not to shame the province, but to explain why some here feel a sense of déjà vu when they hear these verdicts come down, why they feel there's no justice for them in courtrooms in Saskatchewan, whether they're there as accused or victims. This is an extraordinary province. We live in an extraordinary country. In every way, well, in almost every way, we're the envy of the world. But the view looks different depending where you stand. In concluding the inquest he chaired into the death of Neil Stonechild, a 17-year-old Cree University student whose frozen body was found outside Saskatoon on November 29, 1990, Mr. Justice David Wright wrote that throughout the inquiry, I was reminded again and again of the chasm that separates Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this city and province. Our communities do not know each other, he said, and they don't seem to want to. This is not unique to Saskatchewan in any way. I think reserves are going to go down as one of Canada's more perfect or flawless creations. Here we are 150 years later, living side by side, and yet living separate lives, divided with different views of Canada and the way it treats us. In a different reality, what happened in Saskatchewan on that farm in August of 2016 might not have split the country along its seams. I want to turn now to consider the ways the justice system treats Indigenous offenders. We've thought about the ways Indigenous victims are treated in trial. But the focus of the study I did, which is the basis of this lecture, looked at how Indigenous offenders were treated when they showed up at bail court or for sentencing or in prisons and jails. And to start, I want to outline some of the data I uncovered in my research. This is a numbers-heavy part of the night, but I think it's really important because I think some of these figures would surprise a lot of people. It did me. Canada's crime rate just hit a 45-year low. That was last year. It's been dropping every year after peaking in 1991. At the same time, the number of people incarcerated recently hit an all-time high. And if you dig a little further into those numbers, an even more disquieting picture emerges. While admissions of white adults to Canadian jails declined in the last decade, Indigenous incarceration rates were surging. For women, they're up 112%. As of this year, 41% of the women and 25% of the men sentenced to provincial and territorial custody in Canada are Indigenous. This is a group that makes up 4% of the population. In the US, which is our go-to example for the asymmetric jailing of minority populations, Black men are 6 times more likely to be imprisoned than white men. In Canada, the Indigenous incarceration rate is 10 times higher than for the non-Indigenous population. That's higher even than in South Africa at the height of apartheid. Here in Saskatchewan, if you're an Indigenous man, you're 33 times more likely to be incarcerated than a non-Indigenous person. I've been to prairie courtrooms where Indigenous defendants make up 85% of criminal caseloads. If you go to Manitoba's women's jail in Headingley, as many as 9 of 10 women there will be Indigenous. At Stony Mountain, which is the men's prison, Indigenous men make up 65% of the inmate population. The Saskatchewan Pen has about the same figure. I think it's 66% as of the last head count. And then once they're in prison and jail, Indigenous offenders serve much harder time than anyone else. Indigenous inmates are placed in minimum security institutions at half the rate of their non-Indigenous counterparts. That means they end up in MACs, where they have no access to the programs that might get them into minimum and medium jails and prisons. They're more likely to be placed in segregation. One in 3 cases of segregation are Indigenous. Indigenous people make up 1 in 3 people who get placed in segregation. Once they're there, they spend a lot more time there than non-Indigenous people. They account for almost half of all self-harm incidents. They're more likely to be restrained in prison, to be involved in use of force incidents, to receive an institutional charge, and to die there. Often they're there because they failed to comply with a curfew or a condition of their bail, or they're a low-level drug offender caught up in Canada's harsh new mandatory sentencing. Canada's harsh new mandatory minimum sentences. That's one reason for the upsurge. In its time in office, the Harper government passed more than 30 new crime laws, hiking punishment for a range of crimes, limiting parole opportunities, and also broadening the grounds used to put young offenders in jail. But the problem isn't just these new laws. Although police carding in Toronto has put street checks, which disproportionately target minority populations under the microscope, racial profiling alone is not to blame. The story I did showed that at every step, discriminatory practices and a bias system work against an Indigenous accused. From the moment that person is stopped by police in the streets, to their appearance before a judge, where they're twice as likely to be denied bail, to their hearing before a parole board, where they're 30% more likely to be denied parole. This is why criminologists have begun quietly referring to Canada's prisons and jails as the country's new residential schools. This is the only way we know how to deal with people diminished by the economic and social impacts of our colonial past, of residential schools, and of the consequences of the country's racist policies. It's not just inhumane, but it's also an incredibly expensive way to deal with these issues. And it does nothing for public safety. Any criminologist will tell you incarceration has no effect on bringing down crime rates, and it actually increases the rate of reoffending. And if you talk to a lot of chiefs, they'll tell you that offenders are being returned from prisons and jails more hardened, more violent, more hopeless, more angry. And the system, of course, is destroying Indigenous families. We're never going to achieve equal education here in Canada for Indigenous kids, or address chronic joblessness, or that sense of hopelessness that's driving suicide rates, as long as we continue to wage war on the most vulnerable among us. I once asked an inmate who'd cycled in and out of provincial jail in Manitoba what was going to happen to him when he was released. He told me he would be dropped off just inside the city limits at the first bus stop. They'd give him bus fare. He'd be wearing the clothes he came in with, and that would be it. You know, because he didn't know any other neighborhood in the city, he knew he'd end up back in the North End, back where his problems started. And, you know, had he been released on bail, right there he might have been breaking one of the conditions of his release. He said, you know, every time he's come out, he has a hard time getting a job, and he can't access certain housing. And because he has a violent charge on his record, he worries about visiting his sister's kids, his friends' kids, because Child and Family Services are circling, and he worries about bringing more attention to them. And so he feels isolated. He starts to feel hated. He starts to feel feared by a society that didn't really have a lot of time for him in the first place. And even though he's promised, he makes himself this promise every time he's in jail, that this is going to be the last time he does this, that this is the last time he's going to end up in a jail cell. Desperation kicks in. He needs money, and so soon enough, he's selling drugs again. He said it's like living in a parallel universe. Once in, you can't get out. You're stuck there. A criminal lawyer in Toronto told me what we're doing is using our criminal justice system to defend ourselves from the consequence of our own racism. Indigenous people are not locked up in great numbers because of a crime spree. They're there because of the impact of social factors and historic policies. And I want to briefly turn now to that history, just to give us some context. For a lot of us, this crisis feels new, but its roots are as old as the country. The foundation of the Canadian dream is racism. It's there in the doctrine of discovery, the idea of terra nullius, the idea that this was an empty land, there for the taking, despite 15,000 years of habitation. It's there in the removal of Indigenous communities from their traditional territories. It's there in the broken treaties. Before the BNA Act, the British North America Act, the Government of Canada exerted no control over Indigenous people in the West. But John A. Macdonald was desperate to get to that coast, and he wanted to get to the north. And so that meant he had to bring Indigenous people under his control, under government control. And so this is where the idea for treaties comes in. Authorities met resistance right from the beginning. The bison was in the process of being exterminated, and Indigenous people said, hold on, we need some guarantees here. And so food aid became a key part of these treaties. A guarantee that was subsequently used as a weapon. In denying starving people food, the government forced them to trade their freedom for rations. So if you want this food aid, you've got to come onto this tiny little reserve we've carved out for you. And we know from James Dashik's work, completed here at the University of Regina, that within a generation, Indigenous bison hunters went from being the tallest in the world due to the quality of their diet to a population so sick they were believed to be racially more susceptible to disease. Indigenous people also asked for schools in their communities to educate their kids. They saw the world was changing and they wanted to be full partners in this growth. So a guarantee for schools became a key part of Treaty 1, and it was replicated in every treaty after that. But the government came up with a different idea for these schools, hence was born the residential school system that taught Indigenous children they were inferior, they were heathens, they were savages, they were irrelevant, they had no culture worth protecting. Their languages were scrubbed, their identities were erased. 7 generations of children went through these schools, and so much harm was done. In 1999, the Supreme Court said this history of dislocation, of disadvantage, of trauma must be recognized when judges sentence Indigenous offenders. The idea was to push them to use restorative sentences or conditional sentences to try to treat the real problem. This is the so-called Gladue principle. And Gladue could be a powerful tool to deal with the mass incarceration of Indigenous people, but the problem is, where Gladue is most needed, here in Manitoba, it's being virtually ignored. I said I wasn't going to pick on Saskatchewan, but experts have shown there are real problems with the way justice is being administered here. I met a lawyer called Jim Scott in Saskatoon who grew so troubled by the harsh sentences he was seeing handed out to his Indigenous clients that he decided to conduct a study. He went and found every publicly available online criminal decision made in the last 20 years, and he wanted to see how Indigenous offenders were being sentenced compared to non-Indigenous offenders in light of Gladue, which supposedly should have been lessening their sentences, or judges should have been coming up with different sentences for this population. But Scott's data found that Gladue reforms here have failed miserably. In fact, in Saskatchewan, Indigenous offenders are sentenced to more than twice as much jail time as those where there's no indication the offender was Indigenous, 3 times higher for hazardous driving and 10 times higher for assault with a weapon. Gladue isn't just a suggestion, it's the law now. If a judge fails to apply it, it's grounds for appeal. This is another big problem in Saskatchewan because the appeals court here has also been called out repeatedly for ignoring Gladue. Cunliffe Barnett, a retired judge in BC, who has some links to Saskatchewan, became so disturbed by the decisions he was seeing from the High Court here that he conducted a similar experiment as Jim Scott. He sat down and got every decision he could find that involved an Indigenous offender and tried to see where judges had actually applied Gladue. His data showed an 8% application rate for Gladue in cases involving an Indigenous defendant. In some cases, Barnett said he felt like the Conservative appointed court was trying to avoid stating the person was Indigenous at all, so they didn't have to apply Gladue. Cunliffe says, too many judges are going to tell you, I understand Aboriginal people, but they don't have a clue. He says they've made judgments on Aboriginal people for years, but they've never actually set foot on a reserve. They've never talked with ordinary Indigenous people. The only people they know are the people who are coming before them in the court. The appeals court here, last time I checked, which was about a year ago, was entirely appointed by Conservative governments. Almost every judge came from 2 or 3 white shoe big city law firms in the province. Almost all of them practiced corporate law. One, as far as I could tell, 1 to 2 had experience with criminal law. There's another attempt to deal with mass incarceration that's being ignored here in Manitoba. In BC and Ontario, First Nations courts, which are modeled after courts in Australia and New Zealand, are in heavy rotation. Only Indigenous offenders can appear in these courts, and they have to agree to enter a guilty plea, and they have to have been charged with a minor offense. There can't be any mandatory minimum involved in that sentence. So it's a pretty, it's a pretty small group of people who are able to appear before these courts. And then the offender works with the judge, and there are 2 or 3 elders in the court, and they come up with an alternative sentence. I sat in that courtroom for a couple days, and as far as I could tell, these sentences generally involved treatment for addiction, anger management, often parenting classes, and cultural programming. And all of this is rigorously monitored. This is not getting out of jail. I mean, if you fall off the wagon, you go straight to jail. And they monitor these people super closely. You've got to appear before the judge every 2 months. And if you don't appear, you're issued a bench warrant just like in regular court. The point of these courts is to try to address the problem underlying the criminality. Often, that's addiction. We don't have any data in Canada yet for these courts. They're fairly new. But we know from the Australian experiments that in some cases they've more than halved recidivism rates. So the rates of reoffending are down by 50%, which is massive. The next one I'm working on is about a murder that occurred in 1963. It happened in a small town called Glasland, which is out by North Battleford. In May of 1963, an 18-year-old named Alan Thomas, a Saulteaux man, was killed when a party of white men raided the encampment he was living and apparently beat him to death. The next day, 9 white men from the town were arrested and charged with non-capital murder. They were farmers and businessmen. Some of them were brothers. They were kind of the bright lights from the community. One of the men who had been accused testified that they were out for no good They were out to cause trouble that night. There were a lot of twists and turns, but in 1966, 3 years later, a trial was eventually called. 6 men were not charged, 3 were charged with manslaughter, and an all-white jury delivered its verdict on Friday, May 13th, 1966. All 3 accused were found not guilty of manslaughter. The presiding judge said, I hope that nothing like this ever happens in this part of the province again. But there have been a number of trials in Saskatchewan since Mr. Justice Tucker spoke a half-century ago. Trials which give Indigenous people real cause to believe and say there's no justice for them in Saskatchewan courtrooms and that the odds are stacked against them, whether they become involved as accused people or as victims. I started off by saying we avoid talking about race because it's so uncomfortable. It feels dangerous, it feels overwhelming. We feel complicit, some of us feel guilty or blameworthy, but we've got to figure out how to talk about this because we can't seriously talk about the justice system without considering the racial context in this part of the province, in all prairie provinces. The problem is whether or not we see race, whether we acknowledge it, it does exist, and it does affect people and the way they move about in the world. So if we don't face up to these ugly realities, these uncomfortable truths, we risk repeating them. So when supporters of the Stanley verdict declared it's not about race, and then they talked about Indigenous people being drunks and thugs and criminals, it betrays their true beliefs, their motivations. People who tweeted a photo of Stanley with the slogan, Making Saskatchewan Great Again, are bringing race into this question. You can't believe the jury was right and accept, you believe that the jury was right to accept Stanley's defense and then celebrate that verdict. It's dangerous to take the wheel of a car blindfolded, obviously, and it's dangerous to try to address these issues and these crucial policy questions while closing our eyes to the racial dimensions. The other worrying trend I've seen since Stanley is this focus on protecting the actors in the justice system, the jury and the judge particularly, rather than asking whether justice was actually served in this case. I think we have to acknowledge that judges and juries are not above criticism. Despite the fact they perform this wonderful public service, we can and we should criticize decisions. We can and should be talking about the failings of the system. This is how we make progress. We have to remember this debate doesn't belong to MPs, to lawyers, to experts. And I say this especially to all the students in the room. We all have a role to play in this. We need all kinds of people to participate. People with open hearts and minds, people like yourselves, people who believe there may be more to this world than meets the eye. Each one of us, through the way we interact with ourselves, through the example we give to our children, can contribute in this. We need to approach these issues differently. We need to understand more about the system and the background issues and the historical context, the reasons some of these people came into conflict with the law in the first place. And I think if we can create that aura of respect, if we can create respect for our teachings, for our cultures, if we can come to a truer understanding of the history of this wonderful country and how it continues to impact us, if we can change these conversations, I think we can eliminate a lot of the conflict that we call racism. Thank you very much.
Now the floor is open for questions. We are going to have around 20 minutes for questions. And I see a hand immediately. Yes, sure. Please. Before you go, yes. I would like to remind you, please keep your comments very short and just ask a question. Thank you.
That's short.
Yeah, okay.
I want to ask in French, because that's pretty short.
Oui, je parle français.
Okay. My point is, I'm an immigrant, now I'm a Canadian citizen. The thing which bugs me the most is the legal system, but also who owns the land. Mm. And the key aspect of this is, I remember stories about London, Alberta, and the same everywhere. Who owns the land makes the law. Really, my question is, what would you say if we were to change the colonial legal system to basically include the First Nations, Métis, Inuit into the proper legal aspect of being a nation?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. It's such a complicated question, and the fact is.
Well, my question was.
Sure. This fellow here says he's an immigrant, he's from France, and he is very upset by this question of the land question, who owns the land, and he's wondering if there's some mechanism in place that would include where ownership would be included for Anishinaabe, Cree, and Métis people. Is that about what you asked?
As nations.
A nation within a nation, which means the same as French, the same as English, First Nation, Inuit,
Yeah. Well, I think it's a bit beyond the realm of what I was talking about tonight. The land question is so complicated, and it's so different in every part of the country. In BC, where I live now, there aren't many treaties. The government got as far as BC and decided it no longer really had to sign treaties. And so there are a couple in the province, in the south and in the interior. But for the most part, there are no treaties in BC. And so we're having to make treaties in this modern context. which is an incredibly complicated process. But the land question is one of the most crucial, and legal standing is as well.
Very short. Yes.
Just some information. Quickly, I'll say it. I come from North Stapleford.
Okay.
I remember the last time, as a wee child. I'm 80.
Okay.
We had to stay indoors. It was fearful. But,
because the climate was so.
pardon?
Because of the climate after the murder. Yeah.
Frightful.
Yeah.
In the early 60s, okay? The people involved in that, I pursued this over the years.
Yeah.
Were addressing, they went out to some of the farmers, recruiting, addressing clan roads. There was a nest of the Ku Klux Klan up there. Just carefully, I just open it up a bit. You might want to look at that area was settled very late, so you're looking at a 50-year time period.
Yeah.
And that's immediately following past system be done away with and the extension of citizenship. So there you have so-called integration and citizenship. It's also one of nationalism. Who are the people of the nation versus who we don't want in our nation? And I'll end with one sentence. South Africa came here many times, looking at it. And some of the actors of the treaties in Canada went to the Cape Colony and started the treaty process there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the Bantustans and the pass system were both Canadian inventions.
Any other questions regarding the justice system, the prison system? Yes, it's fine.
I had listened to an article or news report about Black law enforcement
Yeah.
saying that approximately only 10 have been written in the past year, and 25 in the past 3 throughout all of Saskatchewan. But that you don't need any formal training to write them.
Yeah.
Why do you feel there's such a lack?
Because there's no funding. You're supposed to be able to access Gladio at any point. So whether you're in bail court, whether you're in prison or jail, you're supposed to be able to access a Gladio report. But none of the governments are stepping forward and funding these things properly. I think in BC there is a system now, and they're trying to make Gladio report writing part of criminal justice programs at community colleges, but that hasn't taken off yet. So yeah, you're right. I mean, a big part of the problem is that it's really hard to get a Gladio report written. It means going into a person's community and speaking to their aunts and uncles and trying to get a sense of the history of this First Nation and of this person's family. So they're really intense. They're intensive reports. They're costly, and we're not really willing to pay for these things. We think it's a great innovation, but who's going to pay for it? Yep. Oh, hi.
The question I have is which media were against you
In Winnipeg?
for doing all your work?
Oh,
Could you repeat the question?
yeah.
In case, yeah.
A woman in the front is asking what media was against me when I do my reporting. I think the story I did about Winnipeg came out right after Tina Fontaine was murdered, and a teenage girl, First Nations girl, Renelle Harper, had been beaten almost to death and thrown in the Red River. And there were all kinds of things going on in Winnipeg at the time. There was a mayoral race, and there were all kinds of accusations of racism on the campaign trail, and relations were really fraught. And then I came in with an article with that headline, and I don't know so much that it was other media in Winnipeg, but it angered a lot of people. And there's a group of people in Winnipeg who understood what I was trying to do, and you know, to get people talking about these issues. But I think you know, people felt like I was picking on them, that I was picking on Winnipeg, that I shouldn't be talking. You know, we shouldn't be exposing these kinds of things. So not so much media as regular people, I guess.
Yes, please. So in light of all of these complexities and the challenges that we all face in this new world that we're in, first, what can people in your profession do to challenge their own systems, and what is the advocacy mode that people can use, and how do you call them to action within your own profession? And then what can the rest of us do to support that?
Yeah, I think, you know, with the death of Tina Fontaine, I realized that I was another system that was failing Tina and people like her. And that's, you know, I decided for the next year I would focus exclusively on Indigenous issues and try to put these issues on the cover of the magazine as often as I could. That's turned into a 4.5-year project. I'm still almost exclusively working on these issues. And I think that Indigenous and non-Indigenous journalists in Canada have, well, the TRC has called on us all to participate in this. And, you know, I think we have a responsibility as journalists to be very careful in the way we frame these issues. And so one thing I've come to try to do is, okay, if I do one article focusing on negative, you know, on negative stories, like an article focusing on deficiencies in the justice system, the next time I try to tell a story of resilience. You know, there was so much focus last year on suicide crises in northern communities in Manitoba and Ontario. What I really wanted to do, I did one story, but I wanted to do a whole series looking at First Nations communities where there'd been a suicide crisis 10 years ago, and yet there's been no crisis, there's been no suicide since, no suicide attempt in 10 years, and there are these communities, and I think it's really important for us as journalists to tell these stories because not only are they good stories, but they're really helpful. You know, a community in northern Saskatchewan might benefit from learning what, you know, this community in northern BC did, or you know, a community in the BC interior. So I think we have to do a better job in media of how we position these stories, because I think we really risk reinforcing stereotypes, and we can't just tell negative stories because we make these problems seem insurmountable when, you know, when they really, you know, when that's not the message we should be giving people. They really, you know, these are solvable problems, and it begins with minds and hearts opening and people being willing to think differently and make policy differently. I think you go with the money argument. I mean, the way we're doing things is so expensive. If you look at the childcare system, taking a kid out of their home and putting them in care for a month costs $11,000. Where you know, if we gave the family the supports they needed to keep that child in the home, it could cost as little as $500 or $1,000. I mean, people need food to get through the month. People need someone to come in and clean the house. So I always try to bring in the money argument, because that's how you know, for a lot of people you get to them through their heart, but for others you just show how expensive the way we're doing things right now is, and where this is going given population growth and all of that.
Hi. I just wanted to touch on what you just said about money. Okay. I personally have spent some time incarcerated. And a lot more money, like it costs what it is now, but at that time it was almost $200 a day to keep somebody in jail.
Yeah.
And if that money was maybe to put toward programs to, I don't know, educate people to keep them out of jail, or give them a support system, it could be way better spent. And a lot of people I find that are surprised to find out that I've been in jail, people just don't know. They just don't know what it's like. They don't know what it's like to be an inmate. They don't know what it's like for the family. They're just unaware, and if we maybe just got it out there, it might stop for that trend.
fantastic comment. I have nothing to add to that. I think that's a wonderful idea.
Thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, that takes bravery.
Final call. Oh, yes, please.
I've been very concerned about when I keep thinking about and reflecting on incarceration.
Yep.
And the whole fact that so many governments have passed it on down the line, the whole idea of warehousing all these people. And I think it was the last under the Blakeney government that there was any kind of attempt to provide any kind of semi-comprehensive educational opportunities for people in prisons in Saskatchewan. And so we have these people serving this time, and we know that the demographic changes are real, that are coming, that more and more Aboriginal people are going to have a place in Saskatchewan. And yet we're not training them, we're not giving them any kind of opportunities, we're not educating them. Whereas we know that education in prisons brings the recidivism rate almost to zero.
Yeah.
And the opportunities are here, but we're wasting them. Yeah. I think it's really
yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think two systems we really need to focus on our child care and the prison system. And they're two systems that we cannot get policymakers to pay attention to, because we're talking about people who are living on the very margins of society. In some ways, they're living on the knife's edge. And middle-class concerns, if you want to talk about housing policy or education issues, those kind of middle-class issues get a lot of attention from politicians. And these issues get left behind because we're talking about people who don't have a voice. And so I think when I say there's a role for all of us, I think we need to tell our politicians, our mayors, our MPs that we need you to focus on this, and we need to do what we can to call attention to this, because I think you're right. These are systems that we need, that need our attention. And you know, things like books in jails and learning opportunities can do so much good. You mean when I'm interviewing people? Yeah, I guess it depends on who I'm talking to. If you're, the more, it just depends on the person. Have you noticed? What have you noticed?
Not a lot of discussion in that area, but I was just wondering if people are starting to make that part of the conversation or if it's seen as any useful.
It certainly gets brought up by Indigenous people. Yeah, I mean, it's. I was speaking earlier at dinner about the fact that journalism more and more is we need explosive headlines and explosive stories to get people's attention, and that's to the detriment of these issues. So I think consciously I did choose a fairly provocative title to get people's attention. This was the idea that these are the new residential schools is something I heard from criminologists, and it's stuck with me the whole time. I was doing this story because it, I think we can all understand that. But in telling these stories, do you mean?
Can you use the stats?
Yeah.
To actually draw out that story, the analogy?
Oh.
The impact on communities of, this kind of institutionalized.
Yeah, the institutionalization and the warehousing of people in terms of the numbers as well.
Yeah.
I will try. I think, I mean, the parallels, I've more, when I look at child welfare, those numbers are kind of more obviously parallel, but I haven't actually broken down the numbers for residential, for the justice system. I think that's a really important area for me to look at. Thanks for the question.
It's going to be our next article. Wait for that.
Yeah. The next series is actually on childcare.
Yeah. All right, I don't see any more hands. All right, I'll do my closing remarks then. It's my turn. I would like to thank you all for attending tonight's lecture. We are very grateful to Nancy Macdonald for a presentation of the 2018 Stapleford Lecture. She has provided us with a crucial perspective on the discrimination faced by Indigenous peoples in the justice system, and she has highlighted the devastating impact, the devastating degree to which Indigenous peoples continue to be impacted by institutional racism. At this moment, and in this particular place, I cannot think of a more urgent conversation. Many thanks to Nancy Macdonald. Let's show her our appreciation. And I would like to thank the Stapleford Lecture Committee, which includes myself, Chris Bandag, Tom McIntosh, and Bridget Klest, supported by the efforts of Milagros Charias and Cara Vincent for their contribution toward making tonight's event a success. Thank you as well to Bill and Leanne McLean sitting over there for their attendance on behalf of the Stapleford family. I would like you to give our appreciation by just applauding, because they have been attending this annual lecture series for many years. And thank you all. Thank you both. It's a great pleasure to see you at this event every year. I look forward to it. Thank you. And I share my gratitude to the Ernest William Stapleford and Maud Banting Stapleford Lecture Endowed Trust for making this event possible. I wish you all a very good night and invite you to stay and enjoy some refreshments in the lobby, right just outside. Thank you all and good night.